Welcome, everyone. This is Mayor Steve Haggerty, and you're joining our series on policing here in Evanston. Today, we are going to have a conversation about calls for service. If we want to really dig into our police department and understand what our officers are doing, understand where there may be opportunities to either have others do it or to change the way that we police here in Evanston, it's critically important that we understand the data. There's a lot of work going on right now to drill down and analyze the data. All of that work isn't complete yet. So we're not going to have all the answers to questions that you may have. And again, this is being broadcast live on Channel 16 as well as on Facebook Live. So if you're watching on Facebook and you have a question during the next hour, feel free to put that into the comment section. We have city staff who are monitoring that and then feed the questions. And we try to get those questions answered during the session. Today, I'm delighted to have with us our Police Chief, Demetrius Cook. With him is our Assistant Communications Coordinator, Christopher Voss. And to the Chief's left is our Records Coordinator, Sarah Jones. So welcome, Sarah. Sarah does a lot of work behind the scenes whenever FOIA requests and other record requests are made of the police department. So she's one of those unsung heroes who's working behind the scenes every day to fulfill needs that we have here in the community. We also have joining us today Alderman Eleanor Revelle, who is our 7th Ward Alderman here in Evanston, and she is currently the chairperson of the Human Services Committee in Evanston. It's the Human Services Committee that oversees the police activities and police department and police complaints and all of that here in Evanston. So I thought it would be good to have Alderman Revelle join us today. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Alderman Revelle because there was an important City Council or Human Services Committee meeting this past Monday. And I know that the committee, which is comprised of our elected representatives. So these sessions that we're having, as I've mentioned, is to set a foundation of knowledge throughout our community on our policing operations here in Evanston. Ultimately, if we as a city decide to change the budget of the police department, to make changes to our complaint process or to our use of force standards here in the community, it's our elected officials that are going to have a voice and a say in that. And so I want to turn it over to you, Alderman Revelle, to talk to the community about what the plans are of the Human Services Committee to begin that work.
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you, Mayor Haggerty. Well, as we all have been hearing from many voices in the community asking us to redirect funds from our police department to human services and social services, it seemed to me one important question was to try to find out what does our community want from our police department, and one place to start would be to look at the 911 calls for service. And so that's where the Human Services Committee has been started directing its attention at our meeting this last Monday, and we're going to be continuing that conversation for not tonight, but the following 3 Mondays in August. So it's there's a lot of information to be gathered. So as I personally began to doing some sort of online research about this type of issue, I learned about what Eugene, Oregon started doing roughly 30 years ago, and what some other communities are starting to do today, which is setting up an alternative emergency response system. And these would be for calls for service that don't require necessarily an armed police officer, but rather could be better helped by, let's say, a mental health professional or a public health professional. So in Eugene, Oregon, what they do is they send out a team of 2 people, a mental health professional and a medic, to respond to calls for service dealing with issues for mental illness, homelessness, substance abuse, those kinds of things. So it seemed to me that perhaps if we were to try to set up something like that in Evanston, we would be giving a better service to the residents who are finding themselves in these crisis situations. So with the help of our police chief and the police department, we've been learning more about what are the 911 calls that we receive here in Evanston, and how many of them could possibly be these crisis situations that don't really require a sworn officer response. So we're really just at the beginning of learning about that possibility before Evanston, but I think it holds a lot of promise, and I'm really encouraged by the beginning of our conversations.
Great. So for those residents that are interested in following the work of the Human Services Committee, it sounds like, which day of the week will you be meeting?
Yeah, these are on Mondays, and so the next one will be the 17th of August, and then the following two Mondays in August we'll be continuing the conversation. So at our last meeting, we heard a lot about the kinds of crisis responses that the police department provides, the fire department, and some other entities in the community, in the city. But what we're going to talk about next time is hearing from some of the nonprofits in the community that also provide services that help people in these crisis situations. I want to see if there's a way to partner in some way going forward.
Great. So Mondays are really our policing day in Evanston it has been for July and will be for August. So we're having this session today on calls for service, and the Human Services Committee, as Alderman Ravel mentioned, is going to meet the next 3 Mondays. We are going to have the policing series continue, the mayor's policing series as well. Our next meeting is going to be next Monday, August 17th, and that's going to be on police use of force, which we talked about once already, but it's going to be a perspective from impacted residents. So we are going to have residents here in Evanston that have been impacted by use of force on this show to talk. And I think that's important for us as a community, for our police department to hear from. On that following Monday, August 24th at noon, we're going to have alternative policing models. So you heard Alderman Ravel mention the CAHOOTS program. We are going to have experts from around the company come and talk about some of the different alternative models of policing. And then we're going to wrap up the series on the last day of the month with a conversation with Black youth on policing here in Evanston. So I think we've got an exciting lineup for the month. But let's get into today's topic on calls for service. Chief, let's just start with a general question. Can you break down, or let's start with even a more basic one before we break down anything. And this is from Alderman Rainey. How many calls per year does the Evanston Police Department receive? And then can you give our viewers a breakdown of those calls?
Yes, sir. I'll defer that to the Communications Assistant Director, Chris Voss.
Good afternoon. So I took the question to be calls meaning calls coming into the police department, whether through 911 or through the desk that require a response. And to that end, the Evanston Communications Center receives 70,249 phone calls, 39,357 of which are to 911, and that's for the year 2019, by the way. While the police desk receives 51,768. That keep in mind that the police desk numbers don't include everything that goes to 311. It does include anything transferred directly to the police desk from 311, but in the event that 311 were to put in a call for service, say, for example, an abandoned vehicle, that wouldn't be included in those call numbers. A breakdown of those calls for service, generally what was included in the annual report is a good example of the full activity workload for the police department, but a non-self-initiated calls for service break down a little differently. The largest percentage of calls for service to the police department are parking complaints, and that there's 2,800 or so parking complaints, and those are dispatched to parking enforcement officers for the city of Evanston. unless a parking enforcement officer is not available. Second to that are accidents of all types, traffic accidents of all types. That includes accidents without injury, accident with injuries, and hit and runs, which the city has responded to 2,673 in 2019. That's followed by check the well-beings, of which there were 2,029, nuisance complaints where there were 1,977, and so on. Disturbances, there were 1,439. That's another example of calls in the top 10. I could spend the whole day breaking down every single number. Patrick, I forwarded calls for events by nature code PDF to him, and if he'd like to bring it up, I can reference some of those there. Thank you, Patrick. That's the committed hours by nature. Can you go to the one that is events by nature code? Well, you know what, the same number is, if you don't have it, I can, the same number is also in here where you notice the total calls of units dispatched and cleared. And if you scroll down to, let's go to page 4. Okay, so there you'll see, for example, premise checks, 3,309 premise checks. Those were calls dispatched and cleared. Of those, 1,761 of those calls were calls that came into the police department, while the remainder of them are premise checks that were self-initiated by officers. So you see that the numbers can vary. That's an aggregate total, but that one in particular, this particular PDF does not break it down into self-initiated versus calls for service. Again, on this page, you'll see nuisance complaints, the 1,988, meaning that 1,977, the number I referenced before, were calls for service, while 11 of those nuisance complaints would have been self-initiated and an officer would have come across them. And we'll reference this document a little bit further when the question about officer or resources comes up.
Well, let's stay on this page for a second here to help our viewers and everybody else, because there's a lot of information. So let's just go to the premise check that you talked about, Christopher. So 3,000. Now I'm missing the top, Patrick. Can you just scroll so we can see the heading at the top, and then we still have premise, I think, there. Okay. So total calls where a unit was dispatched. So 3,309 times a police unit here in Evanston was dispatched to check a premise for somebody didn't report to work, or maybe there was some vandalism on the premise or anything like that. Is that correct?
In partial, yes. So 3,309, the heading on this it comes from the computer system. So it's there's some variance to the meaning dispatched and cleared. The 3,309 is the number of calls for service in addition to the numbers of self-initiated. So a call for service would be something that a dispatcher dispatches a unit to, while a self-initiated is something that a unit calls into dispatch and says, I'm off with this premise check. That number, 3,309, represents both of those together.
Okay, and then while we're here, let's just go to number of personnel utilized. So, just that next column is 6,029. So explain to our viewers what that means, and me. I don't even know what that means.
That is the aggregate total of officers added to the premise check. So on average, you're looking at just below 2 officers responding to every premise check. It is a policy for dispatching that calls of a premise check nature automatically require an officer and a backup officer. So that's why you get close to the 2 over the course of a year.
I see. So that's why it's double, okay, that. Whereas parking complaint, if that's handed off to parking enforcement, that's why that's more a 1-to-1 ratio?
Correct, exactly.
Okay. And so, so premise check, again, if somebody's saying, okay, 6,029, remember, we only have about, remind me, Chief, 200 total officers or people in the police department here in Evanston?
Yeah, we have 150 right now. Currently, we're down 19.
150 officers, and then if we add in the other folks at the police department, it's around 200. Is that right? 215?
It's like 2.25, 220.
Okay. All right, so 150 officers. So many of these premise checks, one officer throughout a year can be doing, dozens and dozens of premise checks. That's why, again, I don't want anybody thinking we got thousands of officers or anything like that when they see these high numbers. Okay, and again, so our viewers can see the police department keeps very detailed records of the calls that come into 911 and the responses by the officers. Leaf blowers, I'm just seeing that one up top, which is interesting because the alderman and mayor, we get lots of emails about leaf blowers, and our police department, I think some people say, wow, we really need to send the police out for this, but our police department had to dispatch 231 times, either self-dispatched or dispatched by 911 to go respond to a violation of the leaf blower law. Okay, so this is, all right, so I just wanted, and then personnel time committed. Okay, I guess if we just want to finish this off and we're on premise check, take us through that number, the 2015 4732.
So that would be in the year 2019, 2015 hours, 47 minutes and 32 seconds of time were committed, the man hours committed to premise checks. And if you notice next to that is a column that says average personnel time committed, 20 minutes and 4 seconds. That is the average per officer that responds to that particular call type. So that's your man hours. Basically.
Okay, this is great data. All right. Okay. All right. So did you want to show another page or slide here?
I think what this, in a way, that what this gets into is the question regarding the demand for most police resources. I think this document provides the best question or the best answer to that question. So I think we can wait until that question comes up.
Okay. Well, again, I mean, so what issues calls do Evanston police officers respond to most frequently? You said earlier, I just want to reiterate, you said parking complaints around 2,800, accidents around 2,700, well-being checks, nuisances, and then disturbances. Are those the ones then that are most frequently responded to by your officers?
Yes, we're taking parking complaints out of it. Again, parking enforcement officers handle that. The order would be traffic accidents, check to well-beings, nuisance complaints, burglar alarms, premise checks, and disturbances for the top 6 call types. And again, those are calls for service, meaning that the call was dispatched to a unit, not self-initiated, where the officer came across it on their own and advised communications.
Hey, Chief Cook, can you talk to us about how much time you and your senior managers and deputy chiefs spend looking at this type of data, and what kind of decisions do you all make, if any, about what level of service should the police be providing, or should another city agency be handling some of these complaints?
Well, we spent a little bit of time doing what you just spoke about. Actually, this morning, we looked at data in terms of how can we get the calls quicker? What is the average response time to a particular call? We look at data as to, what is the officer's committed time to situations, if you know, it's a formula that the computer does, but we can do the formula also by hand, and that came out of Northwestern University Traffic Institute. That particular formula, you know, what is the committed time for a particular event? We look at this data, and it gives us a perspective on how we could deploy people and have a rapid response to some of the situations that take up time in our daily routine.
You mentioned the response time, and that is something that people in Evanston, our residents, care a lot about, whether it's the fire department or the police department. What is the police department's average response time?
It's like 4 minutes and 19 seconds. And that's what we discussed this morning. I would like to get rid of the 19 seconds. You know, we always look at how we could be a little bit more efficient in terms of, you know, is the lag in response time associated with the incoming call to the desk, then being transferred to 911, or is it the calls that come straight into 911? Is it any lag with the dispatcher issuing that call to an officer, and what may that officer be doing at the time of the dispatch call? So my thing is, you know, if you get a call dispatched and the beat officer whose responsibility it is to handle a call in a geographic area, give it to the next beat and let him float down and get to that call. And then when the other officer comes up, he can get relief that way. So this information that we get out of this CAD system is very important. But this system is only good as the information that we put in it. So we talk respectfully with our communications directors to make sure that they're doing everything they can to have the people that work under them do a good job in inputting the proper information so that we can get good results out.
You know, I think it would actually be good for our viewers to understand. You're a familiar face to them, Chief, but you know, Christopher Voss and Sarah Jones aren't, and they both play such a key role here at the city when it comes to policing. Could each of you just talk for a minute about what your job is at the police department?
So in records, we make sure that reports that need to be written are completed, that the information that needs to be on them is there. We handle the moving violation tickets, the arrests, the incidences. We do the FOIA requests for data that goes out. And the main thing is making sure that our system is accurate so that when people ask for things that we can provide it correctly.
Okay, all right, so that's the record. That's the records department.
One thing she didn't mention, though, Mayor, which is important, is when you request specific information that may not necessarily, the data is in the CAD system, but we have to put it in a readable format so that people can understand it. Ms. Jones, she writes the reports where that data can be put into, just like the information you just saw, that data was put into that format by these people here.
Right, so it has to be extracted from one system, put into an Excel spreadsheet or something that's
Yes, sir.
understandable. I get it. How about Mr. Voss?
I work under the direction of the communications coordinator, and in doing so, manage the 911 operators who dispatch for both police and fire department for the city of Evanston. We also maintain the radio infrastructure as well as phone infrastructure in the 911 center, and I coordinate as well with the local EMS regional director to do emergency medical dispatching with the communications or with the communications personnel, where we provide pre-arrival instructions for medical calls. So there's a lot of different aspects of the job, but could spend the whole day talking about that, but I'll leave it at that and sum it up.
But it's a big job. I mean, you get 70,000 calls to the police department, and many of them are essential and require an emergency response. High level, of the 70,000 calls that come in, and 39,000 of those come into 911, how many require a response by the police department where an officer's having to respond within a quick period of time? And I don't know how you define that. If it may be like, hey, this is a low priority, this is a high priority.
Sure. I believe in the, when I addressed the council on Monday, this last Monday, the number that I had determined using, setting aside the incoming calls specific only to police that came into 911 alone and were dispatched out, the number was somewhere just north of 14,000 of them, and then 10,300 of them went to fire. So total, it was a little more than 25,000 calls of the 39,000 911 phone calls that required dispatching a unit.
So
I did not do that number for desk calls.
okay, so of the 39,000 calls to 911, you're saying 14,000 of those required a police response, and 10,300 of those were fire related.
Yes, and it was actually, when added together, it was a little over 25,000, so it's something like 14,700 or 800. I don't have that number in front of me at the moment.
And I don't know if he has the number, with the fire response, with those 10,000 or so calls, a number of those calls also require a police officer response.
That's an accurate statement as well, yes.
Here's the thing, Chief, you mentioned a second ago that you'd love to see us take away those 19 extra seconds and be able to respond within 4 minutes of a call to 911. And I think people look at that and they think, okay, well, how do you get there? How do you reduce that? So why don't you talk a little about how does police department increase their response time?
All right, well, it's a number of things. Number one is great supervision. The police supervisor must be aware of what's going on daily on the radio so that he can manage and monitor the response of his personnel. And then you want to look at the input in terms of when the call comes into the desk, how efficient is the desk personnel in taking the information and routing that information up to dispatch so that it could get dispatched as quickly as possible. So the input can come in either from the desk or in a direct 911 call where it goes straight to the communications bureau. How fast and how efficient they are in getting that information to the police officer is what we need to look at. So we're looking at supervision, the supervisor knowing what his people are doing, monitoring the radio, pushing people to be as efficient as possible. I like to listen to the radio. I don't like to micromanage, but I will get on the radio when I hear a response and it's taken a officer what I think may be a little bit too long in getting there. So those are just some of the things, and I think those are the most important things that we need to look at in terms of boosting the response time.
Now, when calls come in to 911, does dispatch make a call about whether this is a true emergency and we need somebody out right away, or, no? I mean, and I'll just give you a couple examples, right? So I call the police. I got an offender bender with somebody else, on Chicago Avenue, and we need to have the police come out here to, write up a report so we can file this with our insurance company and all that. I walked past Lee Street Beach and it was 10 o'clock at night and there's a big bonfire there, as opposed to, there's a suspicious person, I think, there's a suspicious person at my neighbor's house. I see him, and my neighbor's gone. I don't know what's going on. Like, how do you all make those decisions, Chief? Or do you treat everything the same and say, boom, it's got to be, 4 minutes and 19 seconds or less? Or do you make decisions as you are tasking out all of these calls that come into 911?
I think it's done as they come in. I think the police officer makes judgments once he gets the call. Traffic congestion, maneuvering through red lights, when you don't actually have the right under the law to go through that red light, sirens, all of that stuff helps us get to the call quicker. So that decision-making process on how efficient that officer is going to respond, in a way, rests with him. And the supervisor is a person that is responsible for monitoring these calls and looking at his computer screen and knowing how long that officer has taken to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And to address the incoming 911 call as well, 911 operators are required to ask a sequence of questions to determine the emergent situation, whether or not it is occurring at the time of the call. Many people call 911 with something that's not an emergency. Something I like to tell anybody who asks about 911 and what type of calls you take is, it may not be an emergency in the end, but at the time of the call, it's an emergency to the person making the call. The job of a 911 operator is to determine what kind of response is necessary based on the question asked during the call, whether there's weapons involved, whether this is a caller calling about something that happened the other day, in reference to your question about if I was involved in a fender bender. If the caller advised that they were exchanging information with the other person, then the 911 operator would tell them, well, we can send an officer to you for the report, or if you have 72 hours to come into the station on your own volition to continue or to submit that report. Those are some of the nuances to taking a 911 phone call, and each and every one of our dispatchers is excellent at parsing out what is an emergency and what is not, and making sure that the officers who respond are aware that they're responding to a legitimate emergency or something that may be questionably emergent.
And in conjunction with the fire department, sometime in early March, we were teaming up with the fire department to make a how to call 911 video. We find that many adult people don't know what type of situation to dial 911 about. And a lot of people like to take the expeditious route of being able to just press 911 versus calling the 5,000 number and going through the police desk. So we are going to make a video in conjunction with the Moran Center on how to utilize the 911 system. That keeps the dispatchers from being clogged up, and hopefully people will have greater education about the type of things that they should call 911 about.
Alderman Ravel.
Well, just to follow up on some of the decisions that the dispatcher makes. At the meeting last Monday, Human Services, we heard, first of all, about the critical incident training that 40 hours of training that a good number of our officers have received. And I think we also learned that the dispatcher, when there are certain kinds of crisis phone calls that come in, the dispatcher tries to send an officer who's had that critical training. So I'm just interested in knowing, what percent of our 911 calls do end up, seeming to require that kind of crisis response, and are those more prevalent certain times of day than other times of the day, or certain parts of Evanston, or because those are the kinds of things that conceivably could be part of our alternative emergency response system.
Yeah, we have, I think we have somewhere, Alderman, in the area of 89 of our 150 police officers that have been certified in critical incident training. That allows them to deal with a number of situations that create issues such as mental health, domestic violence, suicides, trauma to children in certain situations. So we have the personnel trained up already to be able to deal with that, and it's a continual process that we utilize that. That type of training has a lot of de-escalation built in. Is we have 92 officers. We have 92 of the 150 trained in critical incident training as of this date. So that is a large number of police officers. When you look at it's a 1 week class, it's costly because when we send an officer, if that officer takes us below the minimum manning, we have to hire back a police officer on the street. So this is the city has invested great money in having the police officers being able to do the best job in some of the critical incident responses. And it has paid dividends numerous times. We've had police officers talk citizens out of suicidal events. When we have shootings, they're there to calm the family and able to communicate with them in an effort to get the information that we need to push the investigation forward. So it is a really good thing. Chicago police, they struggle because of the size of the organization to have a number of CIT trained officers on each shift. But Evanston, we way ahead of the curve with that.
In addition, all 16 telecommunicators also observed that same training. They did not go through the same level, but they observed the video portion of that training, and then they follow each month. They take 2 different continuing education classes that are provided to us through third parties that specifically focus on dispatching and the role of a dispatcher in such things as suicidal callers, mental health issues, and that they are up to date on that, and we will continue to keep them up to date on that. So since the call originates to 911, we want to make sure that they're able to diagnose anybody who's having a mental breakdown as well, in addition to being able to get the CIT trained officer to respond to that call.
Christopher, we just had a question come in from Cheryl, who asked, how do dispatchers know what kind of certifications certain officers have in order to dispatch them to certain calls?
Every day you get a beat roster, and along on that beat roster are all of the specialties that an officer might have, and it's simply just marked right next to the officer, CIT. And so they use that as a reference at all times. When a CIT necessary call comes in, they look for that officer, and that officer is sent as the, if not the primary unit, definitely as the backup unit to the call.
Okay. We had another question come in from Rabbi Klein, who's one of our chaplains to the police department. Does the EPD track the nature of a call as a racist or anti-Semitic incident? So in other words, when it comes to hate crimes, do we separately track those with a nature code of some sort?
Sure.
Hate crimes are reported to the state's officers would have to write a report if the incident was considered a hate crime, and that would be tracked through RMS, through the record management system. So yes.
I didn't catch the last part that you said, if something, then they do.
It would require a report to be written, so it is tracked in the records management system, all hate crimes, what the bias of the hate was, the elements of it, if there's suspect information. That's all reported every month to the state.
Okay. And is that a call that's made in terms of whether it's hate or not by the officers that are on scene or by the caller? of an incident?
Yeah, the cause, any crime has, it has elements to the offense. So, when an officer goes to a particular type of call, whether it's a hate crime or a battery, he's trying to determine the elements of the offense that would constitute battery, or the elements of the offense that would constitute a hate crime. And that comes from a continuous review of the Illinois compiled statute, where it has the elements of each crime that's built into the law. And they can look that up on their computers in the car.
Okay. I want to go back to the police department's average response time, which you cited as 4 minutes and 19 seconds to get to a scene. And you talked about, how you reduce that response time is, great supervision, efficiency of desk personnel. I know some people are probably thinking, well, you add more officers. If I add more officers, I can have more. And I can tell you at this moment in time, that is not going to happen, really because of, the situation we're in with the pandemic and the funding pressures and revenue pressures and expense pressures on local governments all around this country. But another way potentially, Chief, right, to increase response time is to take a hard look, which I know the Human Services Committee is, and your team's working with them on all those different responses, right, that Mr. Voss just showed us some of on the screen, and asking ourselves, do these types of incidents require a police officer to be the one that responds, right? I mean, part of it I look at is I say, okay, if we get, what do we say? We got 14,000 calls that police officers have to respond to. Is there a way that either we reduce those number of calls, right, by either saying, hey, somebody else can do this and that's less expensive to have somebody else do it, or we educate our residents and so forth to say, hey, some of these don't actually require the police. You should really call 311 on these calls, and somebody from Public Works can go out and check that nuisance property or whatever it may be. Have you started or do you do that kind of work as well at the police department in terms of doing a deep dive? And maybe this is just something new that I think as a city we're starting to look at. But, if there's 100 different nature codes or 250 going in there, and asking ourselves, is it necessary to have the police respond to this kind of nature code?
Right. Well, when you look at part 1 and part 2 crimes, and in particular part 2 crimes, if it is a coal incident, like we could have a coal auto theft, auto theft happened yesterday. That is certainly something that can be done by a community service officer if we had those type of personnel here. And when you look at the number of nature code calls that we have, which a lot of times tend to be more quality of life, we can definitely send alternatives to address those calls also.
Alderman Revelle, is it fair to say that's the kind of analysis and thought that the Human Services Committee is looking at or starting to think about?
Well, I do think that would be helpful, but I'm thinking about, for example, a mental health call that was coded on one of the charts that we saw earlier in this hour. And so what I'm interested in, what is the outcome for the person in crisis? And so when EPD responds, is the outcome that the person is taken to North Shore Hospital, for example, or if there were a mental health professional responding, would the outcome be different? Would there be some kind of program that the person would be admitted to that wasn't short of being taken to the hospital? I'm just interested in the quality of the outcome.
Yeah, I think that on the back end of getting, because what happens when we go to these mental health calls, we take the person to the hospital, and then a couple of days later, we'll see them again. So the question becomes in our mind is this person really getting the assistance that he needs
Right.
for recovery and to get him back into the mainstream flow of society? So being able to have a response that will ensure that a person is going to a counselor to get his medication, or assisting the domestic violence victim in getting out to court and getting an order of protection, that keeps us from coming back to these calls over and over again, which that will reduce the number of responses that we have if we had good advocacy. And the Evanston Police Department was one of the pioneers in law enforcement for having advocates and certified social workers within the police department. And that came in under Chief Logan back in 1984 when he had 6 advocates in the station, and then we had youth advocacy. We had 4 youth advocates in the station also. Those type of follow-ups is important in reducing the number of times we may have to interact with a person, because they will ship the person into a program that will help them deal with the issues that they're having. So I do understand that what you're talking about, Alderman, but when you look at the number of nature codes we have that the police officer responds to, I'll give you an example. At the football games up north, they have public drinking and public urination around people's houses.
You're talking to the right alderman.
Yeah, if we had, a response from a community service officer to deal with that, the police officer could deal with the more serious nature calls.
Right, sure.
Thank
I
you.
also wanted to address real quickly the data that you're seeing in nature codes is indicative of how the call comes in. It's not 100% a correlation to how the call ends up. So what you see as a mental health situation in a nature code could very well have turned into a misunderstanding once the officer responds on scene, that situation is not as it is presented to the 911 operator or to the desk officer. And that's why there's 2 separate systems, one being the CAD system, which tells you the data as it comes in via call, and the RMS system, which Sarah and her employees are in charge of. And that is the final say of what had happened during the call. So it's important to know that and not to misconstrue this data.
I think that'd be helpful for us as on the committee to understand those 2, the CAD system compared to, what real people do in terms of, I think that's not exactly a clear, I don't think we have a clear understanding of that. So that would be helpful.
Yeah, when they write the report, the supervisor should look at the nature code and determine in his reading of that particular report, does it have the elements of the offense? Does that narrative present a battery, clear cut? And a lot of times we'll fail on that interpretation of whether it met the elements of the offense. So when it goes to records for review, that is where we get the real clear-cut analysis about the type of incident, and we'll send it back to the police officer to make corrections.
We had a question come in from Chelsea that said, how much influence do community organizations have in helping evaluate how EPD should be dispatched for certain calls? For example, can Connections for the Homeless work with EPD on calls related to homelessness?
Well, we do work with Connections for the Homeless. We have people sleeping in bus shelters all up and down Howard Street, and the officer will respond there and call Connections for the Homeless and they do respond, or we'll take the person to a shelter. We even have a system where we'll have a person transported by taxi, and the taxi company cooperates by calling us when they drop the person off, because a lot of people we find along Howard Street want to go down to Pacific Gardens Mission down right off Roosevelt Road. So we do work with these agencies either that day or through follow-up with our problem-solving team in addressing some of these issues.
Yeah, I would agree, Chief. And Chelsea, I can tell you, like, I've gotten emails about homeless issues or other issues around town, and there's a nonprofit in town who really is sort of the leader on those issues. And I may send a note to the chief of police, but I'm also, sending it to Betty Boggs, the head of the Connections, or to, Patrick Keenan Devlin at the Moran Center, or whatever it may be. So I do think there is a lot of collaboration. There's always opportunities for more of that here in Evanston. I know we're coming up on our hour. There's just a couple other questions. There were sort of straggler questions to this discussion, but I think I'd like to get them asked. Chief, Jennifer asked, is all of Evanston patrolled equally? Perhaps you could just explain to our viewers how you set up deployments and patrols around the city.
Yes, sir. We got 8 beats. Each beat is assigned to an officer, a patrol car. Some of those beats have 2-man cars where you'll have 2 officers in a car. They do random patrols. That is the order of the day. Randomized patrols, high visibility patrols. Then on top of that, we may have, between the hours of 4 to 12, we may have 5 or 6 extra detectives, 5 or 6 tactical officers, and juvenile officers who also do randomized patrols. So they'll float, the specialized units will float to wherever the action is going on in town. In addition to having that beat officer. When we have a situation, it could be a shooting, let's just say along the Howard Street corridor, whether it's on the Chicago side or the Evanston side, we'll do saturation patrols for high visibility down there, because you got people getting off of the train. I want them to see a police officer when they get off the train and feel that they can walk home safely, or patronize any of the businesses that's along the way there. So, are they patrolled the same? In a way, yes, because they have officers assigned to each beat, and they're supposed to stay in that geographic location, but they can be pulled out in an emergency situation. For instance, like if we had a shooting, we try to get as many officers over there as possible to stabilize the scene, set up, the boundaries for the crime scene, and to hold back the public until the investigators can get there. But it is a systematic way of beat deployment. It's based on population. We do population-based deployment. So that has always been the deal. Is it possible to relook at that? You should look at that every 5 or so years. Some time ago, I think it was in the mid-90s, Beat 71, which covers the whole south end of Evanston, was split up, and we made Beat 78 to give it a shorter response time in that area where we were having a lot of problems in the 90s. So yes, I think everybody gets their share of police officers here now.
But we're also presumably putting police officers in areas where you're getting a lot of calls of problems and issues.
Yes, like we'll increase patrols in areas where we have trouble. Like, for instance, we had 2 homicides in Beat 77. So not only did we have the beat car, we had 2 saturation cars and a number of specialized units patrolling that one geographic area. And the reason you do that is because you want to erase fear from the public's mind. You want the public to know that we are in response to what's going on in your neighborhood, and we're trying to make you feel safe as you go and come through your daily life.
Right. At the end of the day, you are charged with making sure that Evanston is a safe place to work and live and play, and are using your good judgment about where we best need, police resources to ensure the overall safety of our community.
Yes, and that is a collaborative effort, not just with me as the chief.
Indeed.
But the 3 deputy chiefs and any specialized unit that may have information about a particular area, a particular crime that's being or that's taking place in an area. We are all come together in our deployment meetings and determine how we're going to attack a specific type of crime within a neighborhood.
Thank you, Chief. All right, we're going to wrap up with a question from a reporter here in town, Jeff, who asked, and this is a little off topic, but I want to get it in because I know he emailed this as well. And it's dealing with the radio systems that our police use. Why is the EPD moving to an encrypted radio system? And if you could explain to viewers what that means. And will it help keep officers safe and make criminals less likely to listen into what police are doing? Presumably, if that's happening, if that's an issue, I'd be interested in that. Or is this a move away from transparency towards more secrecy?
Well, it's certainly not about less transparency and secrecy. The Evanston Police Department, we got 16 dispatchers here. We've been on a radio system for the last 50 years in a 400 and 500 megahertz range, where anybody with a scanner can listen. But we're going to the state police radio network, which is Starcom. It is an encrypted radio system. This is the trend. It's been the trend for the last 15 or 20 years, having encrypted radio systems. The Cook County radio system is encrypted. We don't program the radios. We just pay the fee to be on the radio system. And it's important that we be on this radio system because under the system we on now, we can't communicate with Skokie, Wilmette, Glenview. We can't communicate with any of our neighbors. Northwestern, having these Starcom radios gives us the flexibility to listen and communicate with our neighbors. That helps us in situations where we may need their assistance. Everybody in Cook County is either on Starcom, which is the state police radio network, or the Cook County radio network, and they are encrypted. We don't have the code plugs for these. They use an AES encryption. So that is a decision of the county and the state police, and we are happy to be a part of that.
So it's going to make us much more effective on big events where we have to work with other jurisdictions nearby in terms of,
yes,
managing the incident. That's actually one of the biggest things, that when my company comes in and does after action reviews after these big events, the lack of interoperability in communication is a huge issue. It always seems to come up.
And the radio system, it allows us to communicate downstate. We can communicate with anybody in Illinois if we need to.
Let me ask you this. Just based on the question, what's the downside to this? There are, residents out there, right, that like to tune in and know what's going on in terms of different calls. So they'll no longer be able to have that access, or the media maybe used to do that and they're not able to. Is that the downside to this?
Well, the FCC, they're the ones that they ordered everybody to move off of the 4 560 to 512 megahertz range. 10 years, they gave us 15 years or so to do it. And now is the time. Evanston should have been done it. But nevertheless, have moved. We've purchased our radios. And those frequencies are going to go by the wayside. We're moving up in the megahertz range to the 700-800 megahertz. And the radio systems just happen to be encrypted. It is no way that we said, well, we're going to move to these particular frequencies so that the public can hear us. It's just the way the radio system is designed and managed by the state police in Cook County.
Got it. Well, thank you, Chief, for taking that question. I think we were able to hit all the questions that people had and that they message in via Facebook today. I know it was just a sort of a conversation today, and you weren't able to see a bunch of data up on the screen. I do promise you that the conversations that the Human Services Committee is having, being chaired by Alderman Revelle, is going to get into that. That information can be found in the packets that Human Services Committee will put up. I also want to give a shout out right now for where you can find the EPD annual report that Mr. Voss mentioned at the beginning. It is chock full of information. It was in a recent city council packet, so all the city council members were able to review it. But Chief or Christopher, could you let people know where online can they find the EPD annual report? We have it on the city website, I presume.
Yeah, it's on the city website, and it's under records on the city website.
All right, but if you just Googled, if you were just take me too long to find that records page, just Google EPD 2019 annual report, a police report, and it should come up, and you should be able to find it there. And again, it's a very good, thorough report that really drills into some of the data that we talked about today. You're going to hear more about that over the next month. I appreciate everybody tuning in. We're going to do this again next week. It is going to be a great panel, a perspective from residents here in Evanston that have been impacted by use of force in the past, and that'll be next Monday, August 17th, and then we'll do 2 more sessions after that. So thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Voss. Thank you, Ms. Jones, Alderman Revelle, and thank you to the folks who work behind the scenes, Anderson Castillo and Patrick Degnan, for putting this on. We'll see you all next week. Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.